Thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you, Charles, for joining us, and welcome today. Welcome to everyone online and those who are going to be following us on social media. I am Denis Foretia. I'm the Executive Chairman of the Nkafu Policy Institute and the co-chair of the Denis and Lenora Foretia Foundation. And it is certainly a great honor for me to welcome all of you today to this very important conversation. We are meeting today at a time of great uncertainty, not just for the continent, but globally as well. COVID-19 has brought untold havoc to every country. Many breadbasket regions were recently under lockdown, under quarantine. Many supply chains have been significantly disrupted, and the health infrastructure in many countries remain under real strains. As we continue here in Nkafu to react to these changes, to plan and to propose policy interventions, we are very honored to be having conversations like this, conversations with very renowned, very experienced practitioners from across the continent, giving us their take and their view as to how Africa as a whole can come out of COVID, come out strong and vibrant, and be able to provide for its growing population. We are joined today by Charles Boamah, who until February of this year was the Senior Vice President at the African Development Bank based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. Charles is a globally respected finance executive with over 35 years of successively challenging leadership positions and experiences in and outside Africa. Charles, until retiring from the African Development Bank just about 6 months ago now, was the Senior Vice President, as I said, and prior to that was the Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, as well as the Acting First Vice President and the Chief Operating Officer at the bank. And he dedicated extensive time with extensive knowledge of the finances, the operations, the administration of the bank, as well as the development space. He led and championed major initiatives at the bank, including many reorganizations at the bank, re-engineering the business processes there for greater efficiency, and participated in at least the last 3 general capital increases of the bank, and played a significant leadership role in the most recently approved one, which was back in October 2019. So we are indeed very, very honored to have Charles join us today to have this very, what I think will be a very interactive and very insightful conversation. So Charles, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for the kind words, and the pleasure and the honor really are mine. And it's a pleasure to get to spend this few minutes and hello to the audience. And when you said 6 months ago, I said, wow, how time flies.
Yeah.
I guess I must be having fun after I left the bank. So it's a pleasure, and I look forward to a fantastic conversation.
Now, Charles, in the last 6 months, the entire world, as you know very well, has gone through various forms of lockdowns. Various measures have been taken. Now, many countries are in the process of reopening at different speeds, and the number of cases on the continent continue to increase. In a few words, in a few minutes or so, what is your overview of this pandemic, especially in regards to the continent and how many of the countries have reacted to it?
Indeed. Yeah, indeed, as you said, 9 months ago, if anybody had told me that the whole world would be under a great lockdown, I would have said they're crazy. Of course, virologists and so forth do warn about pandemics and so forth, but I don't think anybody, and indeed, just before I left the African Development Bank at the end of February, of course, I think they had just declared us a pandemic, and we're all trying to figure out the effects on Africa and the kinds of responses that Africa should have, even though at that time the numbers were very low. Little did we, expect for it to have this scale. So lives and livelihoods have been disrupted all across. No part of the world has been spared. I looked at this morning, and I think out of the 21 million cases around the world, I think about 5% or so, a little over 1 million, maybe 1.1 million here in Africa. interestingly, the death rate, the percentage of deaths in Africa is a bit lower than the rest of the world. And one interesting statistic was that the recovery rate overall in Africa appears to be higher than the global average in some countries. So that's good. But the overall story is actually a tough one. The policy responses. First, I salute the strong leadership of many African leaders across the continent in terms of taking this on and making this a major issue and ensuring that there's strong leadership and on the matter, including right here where I am in Accra, in Ghana. I mean, the leadership is very visible, very strong, and I think that reflects across the continent, and that's a good thing to see. In terms of the policy responses, obviously one could put them in two buckets, right? There's the immediate, let's fight this, the effects, the short term and all the stimulus measures and so forth that have been undertaken by governments. And then they're also looking post-COVID, whenever that is, hopefully sooner rather than later, the recovery measures, because of course there are so many industries, no sector has been spared. And so going across all the sectors and seeing all the policy measures that need to be put in place. Let me say right up front, I know we'll have the opportunity to develop many of these further as we go on in the conversation. The way I look at this is that there were already certain macro trends, that affect and guide policy decisions. And in my mind, climate change, urbanization, the demographics, aging population in certain parts of the world, and of course, the youth bulge in Africa. Global supply chains and just about digitization of everything. Now, these macro trends will continue, but of course, how they continue will be affected by the COVID-19 experience. And during the conversation, I may come back to some of these trends and sort of reflect them in some of the comments that I do make. So let me pause here. It is unprecedented, of course, the global contraction. And GDP growth in Africa to contract this year some 3.7% and a slight recovery next year, but even so that probably brings us to pre-COVID levels. So this is a tough one and one that requires very tough policy measures by African countries. And we're seeing them across, and we'll obviously be talking a lot more about in the course of the conversation about many of these things and some of the more concrete things that need to be done.
Yeah, so Charles, regarding more concrete things, and if you look at the strain that the pandemic is putting on all countries, on African countries in particular, and in a lot of specific countries like Francophone Africa or so, that have very little physical space relative to a lot of other Anglophone countries. On the continent. When you look at the strain that is putting on revenues across the board, what becomes more important? How would these countries, respond, or should they respond to this tightening of the belt that has been imposed externally across the board? What becomes more important at the national level? When you look at that, how do they navigate this externally imposed constraint?
Sure. The responses, of course, have been at the national level, but also regional and continental level, and hopefully we'll have the opportunity to touch on some of these. As I said, the responses are really two parts. There's the immediate, you have saving lives and livelihoods, right? And on the fiscal space, actually, I wouldn't single out Francophone countries. It's across the continent. To start with, African countries in general do not have that much fiscal space. Even the debt overhang, the debt servicing requirements alone are very choking for many African countries. And so when you add on top of that, the immediate measures that need to be taken to combat this pandemic, there really is not much wiggle room for countries. So in the immediate, of course, some of the responses have been to, and again, this one of the things that the pandemic has done is expose many of the vulnerabilities that we already know exist on the continent. You know, the infrastructure challenge, you know, the problems of inequality, things like that, social protection, inadequate social protection programs, etc. So some of the programs that have been put in place, as you well know, include just trying to keep businesses up and running or still going. If you take the hospitality industry, it's just been devastated. And countries that will have a significant portion of their GDP coming from that sector are clearly, and jobs have been, people have been furloughed or put on just flat out laid off. So there is a flat out business contraction. Also means tax revenues obviously going down. At the same time that the government is called upon and is required to provide stimulus to here in Ghana, for us, and pardon me if I use Ghana as an example, that's where I am currently. You know, the government providing, for example, water for the many affected people. Why? We talk about people just, you know, the protocols, wash your hands under running water. What if you don't have running water? And even electricity and many other things that are taking place. Internet, you know, trying to do things digitally just to reduce face-to-face contact. You know, look at the internet penetration rates on the continent. I think hovers around 40% thereabout. And so some of us are privileged enough to take things like that for granted, but there are many across the continent that do not have that. And the pressure falls on the government with very limited resources to meet these challenges. So it is a tough one. Revenues, you know, business contraction, revenues going down at the same time that there are huge expenses to meet. And I think it's every single country on the continent is facing this problem. It is not limited to any one country.
And you have said before, you know, just as a follow-up to that, regarding the need for real improved efficiencies that across countries in particular. Can you touch on, you know, the inefficiencies? I mean, you spend a lot of time at the bank, you know, trying to make the bank efficient. If you were to transpose that into national policies or so, how does this, you know, efficiency looks like, you know, from your perspective? How would it look like?
Sure. We start with the picture first. We talked about, you know, with the contracting revenues and increasing expenses to start with. Now we also remember that this has imposed, even at the family level, at the household level, new expense line items for families, right? They have to now deal with sanitizers, they have to deal with masks, etc. At the business level, when you talk about social distancing and the fact that companies now need to, you know, sometimes reduce an establishment, you take a dining establishment that is maybe built for 100 or guests or customers. If they now have to only contain 40 people maximum to get social distancing, of course, that has imposed a certain limit to their revenue generation capacity. For me, what that means, whether it's at the household level, at the business level, or at the national level, of course, it means that we have to be ruthlessly stringent on squeezing out in all efficiencies possible to ensure that every single dollar, every single euro, or whatever the currency is, CFA, goes as far as possible. So that's a broad construct. Now, what are some of the things one would look at? I think clearly, again, looking at ensure efficient procurement systems. You know, the accountability, the whole public financial management systems we've talked about in the past. This is something that multilateral development banks and other development actors always talk about. There's a need to be even more stringent on that. And then hopefully in the course of the conversation, we will also have a chance to talk about how digitization can help squeeze some of these efficiencies, reduce inefficient processes, etc., to ensure that governments get the maximum out of. Now, there's actually an excellent example of efficiencies at the continental level. You know, you talk about the policy responses of African countries. And at the continental level, of course, President Cyril Ramaphosa, current AU chairperson, obviously requested, had some eminent persons look at certain things. And one of the things was the African medical supplies platform, I think, something like that. And where this platform, whereas countries were individually, trying to source PPEs, trying to source other needed materials and equipment, competing with the larger economies that are buying in bigger bulks and getting the better deals. This platform is essentially enabling African countries, smaller economies, to be able to, through the platform, get the benefits of economies of scale, right? So this is one example of efficiencies, that creativity that has been unleashed as a result of this COVID crisis. And I would only hope that this will not be a one-off example, that there will be many other cases where we are looking at efficiency, whether at the national level or at the continental level, for countries to be able to use it to stretch the resources as much as they can. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that is a very good, example. I spoke with Dr. Nkengasong at the Africa CDC, and he also highlighted, this initiative by President Ramaphosa, which has been really good in ensuring that various African countries can really procure the medical materials that they need, and I think that's very, very important. Now, still on the continental level, you are a member of the Transformation Leadership Panel, the TLP,
yes,
which is a continental-wide body of eminent persons. It's chaired by former President Sirleaf Johnson of Liberia. And the TLP is a continental-wide, policy advocacy, organization. Can you throw some light on the TLP and its work and how you all are looking at COVID, Africa post-COVID?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, the Transformation Leadership Panel, the TLP, as you said, chaired by Her Excellency, former President of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and it's actually a 17-member body made up of essentially the major organizations that operate in Africa. And so you have, and I actually joined the TLP while I was at the African Development Bank, and I'm continuing to serve on the TLP. It is the brainchild of KY Amoakon of ASSET, African Center for Economic Transformation. And so this was so ASSET, the think tank ASSET, is sort of the analytical engine that supports the work of the TLP. And the TLP has, it has the Vera Songwe from the ECA, it's there. You have, of course, World Bank Africa Vice President Hafez. Hafez is there. You have representatives from also from the private sector. You have the MasterCard Foundation. You do have Mackenzie is part of the TLP. Of course, KY Mwako himself. The Ibrahim Mayaki is there. So I can go on, not to take too much time. And apologies to those I don't mention, whose names I don't mention. But obviously, in the interest of time, let me just stop there. And the whole point of TLP is to bring together all these actors for policy advocacy work. So with regard to the COVID-19, at our last meeting, I think at the end of June, we had a conversation, and there were a number of policy areas, recommendations that were made and actually submitted to the AU. and to African heads of states. The 4 areas that were mentioned, that were highlighted, were basically strengthening resource mobilization and management. And we can go into quite a bit of detail on that. Also, something I did touch on earlier, basically accelerating Africa's digitization. And again, there's a lot to talk about on digitization. And then we think it's very important, and especially, and this conversation we are having is an example of that. It's really continuing to strengthen and build up the African capacity for policymaking, and supporting African think tanks and ensuring that the problems that we face, that the push to solve them comes primarily from the continent. So this is one strong recommendation to and continue to support African capacity building for policy making. And then I'll be remiss if I didn't mention it. Of course, is everything that affects the youth, youth, jobs, employment, and to ensure as part of that inclusive economy. So these were the 4 policy areas, and there was actually a short note that did go to the AU, that did go to African heads of states, and through them we are looking to essentially see that the policy actions address these measures. So let me start there. That's the work of the TLP in a nutshell.
Now, so Charles, let me drill down in one of those that you mentioned, the issue of jobs, and youth unemployment.
Right.
Africa's major problem prior to COVID was jobs,
Yes.
job, and invariably it will remain post-COVID jobs. Where would these jobs come from? And where would they come from? And it's almost like struggling to figure out how many of these countries that are, unfortunately, forgive me, that are extractive in nature. In nature, are unable to create the environment to ensure that there is ingenuity, that is, the private sector can flourish. So where would, you were just recently at the bank and you continue to do all these things around the continent and outside. In your recommendation to African leaders, where would the jobs come from?
Yeah. Gone are the days when you went to school, you graduated, and they are not gone completely, but the formula, if I may put it that way, is that you come out and you're looking for a job in government or in some big company, right? And I think what is happening increasingly and needs to happen a lot more, needs to be supported, is really entrepreneurship. Let's take this whole COVID, as painful as the COVID-19 experience has been, and continues to be. What you do see is a certain level of ingenuity, a certain level of innovation that is coming up. If there's one thing that one can point to coming out of this pandemic with that, it's essentially a wake up, right? A wake up that there are certain things that can and maybe should be done here on the continent. So simple examples. You look around when they talked about washing hands. All of a sudden you have some young people that were coming up with solutions, innovative solutions about solar powered wash basins, things like that. This is just one small example. There are companies, of course, that did not have as their product line, hand sanitizers, when in fact they could have hand sanitizers. So all of a sudden, companies that make alcohol, alcoholic drinks, realized that there was just a little bit of a change. They could make hand sanitizers. So that's a new product line that they've developed. And of course, the ubiquitous masks that we all wear all over the place. So I use these as just small examples of the sort of creativity, the innovation that needs to be supported and brought to scale. Of course, we can spend a whole lot of time talking about agriculture and agro-processing and the need for, and again, having youths and everything that affects that value chain. there are people that are using technology to assist farmers, young people coming out of universities, encouraging that. Technology, the whole coding centers and developing the digital solutions right here on the continent. Again, providing the support. It's not just financing. I mean, it's too frequently we just point to financing as yes, extremely important, but it's that whole ecosystem that would help these young entrepreneurs flourish. And for me, it is all of these different areas that we need to continue to push, to continue to support, to encourage, to create the jobs. So it's actually, in most cases, young people creating jobs and creating opportunities where they actually end up being employers as opposed to just looking to be unemployed only. So that's the in a nutshell, the way I see the whole job equation. It has to come from adding value to our natural products, okay? And in moving up the value chain, we obviously expect to be able to create more jobs for our young people.
Yes, so we are going to take some questions from the audience. So I encourage folks to keep asking, posing questions, and we'll come to it. But let me ask you something about digitization, because you've mentioned it a couple of times already. And the pandemic undoubtedly has revealed, really the fragility of the growth models for many African countries, and it definitely, threatens, to widen the divide between low-income countries like many sub-Saharan African countries and the Western countries. So, in practical terms, how do you think that digitization could be leveraged, to curb this widening divide?
Okay. First, I think I did talk about the internet penetration rate, for example, which for the continent as a whole sits around 40%, let's say. And wide disparities, by the way. There are many countries that are in the single digits on the continent, which means that there are large portions of the population that have not yet been brought into this digital world. Now, within countries, of course, there are very spatial inequalities as well with regard to that. Now, so COVID hits, it's now difficult to congregate in different places. And then we are all here, we are going through this means to have this conversation. And then many other forms of economic activity and social activities are now going on through, through technology. Now, many people are left out of that whole model. And so for me, internet connectivity is getting to be almost on the same level as access to water, access to electricity. And the same arguments that we make in terms of people getting those basic needs apply also to connectivity. Take example, access to, we talked about how do we create jobs. Ultimately, of course, we talk about the financing and access to credit, right? It's important. Digitization is a key component of that. A key component in terms of the even having unique identifiers and being able to essentially build a credit and all of the kinds of things that are taken for granted in countries such as where you are things that need to be built. In many countries, by the way, I speak in broad terms. If you talk about a place like Kenya, of course, they have pushed the envelope substantially more. Payment systems, access to banking services, and thanks to mobile money, mobile payment platforms, there's a whole lot of people that now have access to some form of banking, right? And so we are reaching the unbanked through that. And so these are some of the real concrete ways that through digitization one can. But there's also, and I'll link it to the point earlier about efficiencies. in terms of the provision of services and looking at the infrastructure that we have on the continent, if for every single thing you have to essentially get in a car and move from point A to point B, when in fact that service could be easily rendered digitally. Just imagine the saving of time and money and gas and everything that would take place. So these are real economic impacts that come through essentially being able to digitize certain things and make things more efficient. And one could go on and talk about many more examples, but it is incredibly important. And I think the COVID-19 experience has brought that to the fore in ways that perhaps would never have happened had this not unfortunate pandemic happened. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. Now, let me take a few questions from the audience. We have a question that came from Ruth Abuna, which says, I'll get to a few of these. What measures have been set in force to assist women in cross-border agricultural trade in such trying times of COVID-19? I would take another one from Marshawn Montgomery. Her question is, how have women been affected differently, and what are the prospects for women economic opportunities in post-COVID economies? Can you touch on those two questions?
Okay. Yes, and if I didn't mention gender in my earlier remarks, it wasn't because it is not important. It is critical. And I know before I left the African Bank, we always used to say that there's absolutely the continent is no way that a continent is going to develop to the levels we want to get to without fully tapping the potential of 50% of the population of the continent. So everything I've said, of course, that gender and then women empowerment is a critical part of that. And I'll tap into even the earlier conversation we were talking about job creation. You know, that the job creation with particular attention to women. And in terms of concrete measures that have been, you know, pardon me if I go back to African Development Bank because I left there recently. I don't speak for the African Development Bank, but of course, the affirmative finance action for women in Africa, the AFAWA initiative, for example, was one initiative that was geared squarely towards supporting women businesses across all sectors. I think Ruth's question was, I think, for Africa, was agriculture related. Yes, agriculture, whether it's in food processing, whether it's in the actual farming, and you know what percentage of the population that's engaged in agriculture are women. It's the majority of people in farming are actually women in Africa. And they need all the support, and indeed the support is being provided through programs such as AFAWA and many other programs that target women empowerment, women-owned and run businesses. And those are things that would continue, I think, even post. So they've existed before COVID and should continue and indeed be accelerated post-COVID. I think the second question, I've in a way touched on the second question in responding to the first question, but I'm happy to come back to that if time permits and if they need more.
Great. I'll follow up two other questions before we start. What measures should African countries take in order to reverse, the high rate of unemployment? We talked about that already. That was from Ampi Abu. From Delphine Futong. What are some key actions to be taken now to accelerate post-COVID economic recovery, especially for female entrepreneurs? So we are in the, and now one more, and you'll get to pick and choose. This is from Naida Mohammed from the AFDB. Her question is, how can an institution like AFDB support African cities? You talked about urbanization earlier, which are at the epicenter of the pandemic spread.
Okay. Okay. So I think perhaps the unemployment, we sort of touched on that in terms of and so the key actions in terms of post-COVID recovery. First is when it's post-COVID, I think we all back in March we were expecting that by August, September we'll be looking at the worst effects of COVID and essentially moving forward. But we're very much still in the middle of it. Now, the sense is from many experts is that this is something we're going to have to live with through 2021, right? So I'm careful when I try to respond to that question on post-COVID. There will be a certain living with COVID, hopefully significantly reduce impacts, right? And so the measures that need to be taken are twofold. One, in my mind, are the things that lead to the management of the whole pandemic in terms of continue to reduce the spread, continue to reduce the rates of infections, etc., and so forth. And there, the developments in science hopefully will help them. And so the governments need to continue to take all the actions, including, very important, the various social protection measures, to particularly to the most vulnerable in society. Okay, so there is the immediate measures that need to continue to be taken. Now, with regard to recovery, I'll go back to a point I made earlier, which is that let's not take our eyes off the ball in terms of the big things that the continent needs to deal with. The infrastructure, any recovery effort has to deal with that fundamental issue of infrastructure inadequacy on the continent across all types of infrastructure. Okay, so that remains a major and the price tag, of course, is huge. Now we'll have time to talk about some of the financing mechanisms for this, because part of that response has to do with essentially how not doing things the same old way we have been doing things in terms of trying to, because this is urgent, it is huge, and it requires, and in fact, based on some of the plans I've seen from different countries, there is a huge private sector component to all the plans in terms of the recovery effort. In many cases, 65-70% of the financing is expected to come from the private sector. And so it is incumbent on governments, of course, to create the conditions for the private sector to essentially participate at the scale that we are looking for them to participate. Now, you know very well that one of the things that has happened as a result of COVID is capital flight. So now you have capital leaving at a time when we need the most capital to build the infrastructure, to create the conditions for resilience in most of our countries. So I'd like to go back to the basics. There are the things that have always been critical to our development. So we talk about infrastructure, the whole development of the agricultural value chain are things that we need to continue to do. But we need to be able to accelerate these things, and to accelerate them, you need a huge private sector effort. And I think there's a lot of conversation about all the things that need to be done to ensure that private sector participation significantly increases.
Thank you very much for that. And
so the AFDB cities, there's a question in terms of what I'm sorry, very, very quickly. Yes, urbanization is one of the macro trends and will continue, right? And in our cities, whether it's just even sanitation efforts in our cities, most of our cities are capital cities. If you spend any time in our cities, they are basically gridlocked. The congestion is you cannot book 3 meetings in different parts of the city because you just spent half of the time just trying to get from point A to point B. And so some of the work, the urban renewal, urban infrastructure, reducing traffic, etc., in our cities, are all some of the things that that the bank should continue support, and is indeed supporting.
Thank you very much for that. We'll take one last question or so, last but one from Henry Kwam. Henry, can you ask your question?
Yes, I can. Hello, Dr. Denis and Mr. Charles. So I just wanted to ask a question in regards to digitization.
Yes.
Every year, about 14 million African youths join the labor force. And what I gather from the policy discourse is that we have a tendency to discuss digitization without making it sector specific. So I was wondering if you had some comments on perhaps how we could target our approach to policy advocacy in regards to digitization and making them much more sector specific. Because machine learning, for example, has applications across grid monitoring for electricity, waste management, transport, advanced manufacturing, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I'm glad, and Henry, right?
Yes, Henri.
Yes, Henri. Bonjour. Let me start with even the health sector, since we are in a pandemic, right?
Yes.
When we talk about digitization in the health sector, I think one of the examples I can give is something that I understand a number of there are even private sector entities that are looking to do to essentially help bring health services to the underserved through, for example, increased telemedicine, right? And that is one example very concretely in the health sector that if you look at the doctor to population ratios in most African countries, you know, you're looking 1 to 10,000, 1 to 20,000, etc. And to solve the healthcare problem, it's not just building national clinics and hospitals, and so it's not just a physical infrastructure. A big part of it is actually the doctors and the nurses and the availability of these. Now, that's not going to change overnight, but you can certainly, through digitization, through technology, let me just put it that way, and even AI, bring very needed health services to, let's say, people in the rural areas. And because that presumes that they have, you know, the areas of internet connectivity, etc., to be able to get, you know, this access through telemedicine. So that's one specific sector that I would give as an example. Now we can also talk about the agriculture, where there are many young people across the continent. A few years ago, when I was at the African Development Bank, there was a couple of young entrepreneurs, African entrepreneurs from Zambia, came to me, and they were basically working on supporting farmers with technology, you know, and rain forecasts, all of that, and essentially feeding that information to farmers. So, and this is something that's more widespread, that is being used across the. So I just list those two examples. I think there are many examples I know in the different sectors. I talked about health, I talked about agriculture, education, huge applications of digitization in education and helping to essentially bring quality education to many people across. And I probably should have started this. The skills training education is obviously the bedrock of everything that this continent wants to do. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Charles. Now, one of the things that, you know, it's a recurring theme when we talk about African economies, and you haven't spent more than 20 years at the AFDB, you know, you were pretty much on the front row seat on public and private sector evolution on the continent. There is the notion of government accountability, citizens holding governments accountable. Yeah. And granted, you know, many of our governments are not really accountable to the people. How do you foresee, or what can you recommend as strategies to lead to better government accountability? It's a nuanced question, so to speak, but it's one of those things that you realize. And you may even want to I may even want to piggyback with a question that just came on from Sustain Ahada. He wrote it in French, but basically in English: do countries with their own currency manage COVID better economically or not? Now, those are two separate things. But for those of us in Francophone Africa, the whole issue of having your own currency to manage outside the current construct is a very particular one. But can you touch a little bit on government accountability broadly, citizens holding governments accountable, and how that relates to how well governments can respond or do respond to situations like COVID?
Okay. No, I think I'll start in responding to that by referring to many of the plans that countries are making in terms of the post-COVID recovery efforts, have as an important component in terms of even the financing of these, or really getting these things from just plans to realization, have a significant private sector component. And so for me, that brings up what I've been thinking about quite a bit lately is what I refer to as sort of the trust triangle, right? And you have the citizenry, the society, you have government, and then you have the private sector participants, right? And there has to be trust along and amongst all the three participants in the triangle, right? And so, because if you're looking at 65%, plus some percentage of the means to essentially generate the economic transformation come from private sector participants, there needs to be trust, between the private sector and the government. And the trust, a lot of it comes from, in my mind, a certain, it's not so much a certain predictability, right? If I'm coming to do business, the rules are clear, the terms of engagement are clear, the goalpost doesn't get shifted, from time to time. A contract means something. One can go on and on, and many of the things are some of the same things you see in the doing ease of doing business indexes that you see published. And so governments must, and I think, yes, many countries you've seen, sometimes on the continent, have actually been some of the best reformers, and you see them moving up the index, and you can see the corresponding increase in business confidence, of course, in these areas. Conversely, of course, it's not just a one-way street, okay? The private sector also has to be accountable to both the citizen and to the government in terms of, again, environment. There's a climate environment issues that need to be addressed, and you don't come and just extract or just maximize your profits without regard to sustainability concerns. So there's accountability there, of course. And very importantly is the actions of the citizens to hold governments accountable. Now, the good news is, when I think back to when I was growing up, when I was much little and I was growing up in northern Ghana, and then later on, there was not as much, people do not have the tools to be able to hold government to account. Now in every country, certainly in Ghana, there's a very active public, whether it's radio stations, whether it's TV stations, and so forth, that are actively challenging and asking questions and asking for accountability. It's not perfect, of course, but this needs to continue. I think one of the most important things in the accountability equation is really being able to shed light on things that happen. Mm-hmm. And so whether it's a project that is taking place, where there's light being shed on that, all the affected parties have a keen interest and they should be seeing what is happening on the project and holding the project managers to account. I think these actions, in my mind, will continue to foster greater accountability. Now, without overplaying the digitization point, again, the availability of information is the ease of availability of information on various platforms that people can see and hold in their account is part of the equation. The timeliness of information, if you're doing something and they only produce a report on that 5 years later, what's the point? You should be able to be getting the information almost real time and be able to react and hold people to account. So for me, it's all of these concrete nuts and bolts issues, measures are the things that in my mind would help to increase the accountability and to make that triangle work like it's supposed to work.
Thank you very much for that, Charles. Now, as we start beginning to wrap up, I wanted us to devote the next couple of minutes, to get your thoughts in broad strokes as to whether it's from the conversations and your work at TLPA, or the various recommendations you are giving various governments. What are, and I will take this question, this is a question from Dr. Emmanuel Owusu Segiere. What are the 3 things African governments should target in recovering from this pandemic? I mean, in that short short term strategy. What if you want to? If they should do 3 things basically, from your standpoint, and obviously it will not be the same across the board, but what are those 3 things that they should be doing?
Okay. Sounds like somebody from Ghana.
Definitely.
Yeah. So listen, three things to target. Let me, well, first, it's important to stop the bleeding. I like to use that, sorry to be a bit graphic, but there is a major shock to the system. And so the measures that are being taken, some of the stimulus measures to show up to help businesses stay afloat, efficient businesses, of course, should continue. And I think there have been a number of fiscal measures that have been taken. Even the central banks have also taken certain measures to enable more credit to be available in the system. I'll put all of those in in that category of measures that should be taken. Well, there's no, you have to keep the patient alive, and then of course you move forward to all the other measures to get them strong and up and running. Those should continue. It is taking a toll on, of course, government budgets. We talked about very limited fiscal space. Okay, so that is happening, and I know there are conversations about how to create, additional. We didn't even get into those conversations. How to help give the governments a bit more wiggle room, get more liquidity, etc. There's a whole conversation that is taking place in that regard. I'll leave that in the interest of time. I'll just set that aside for now. But the other things that need to take place, of course, in my mind, will be that given that the recovery, and again, when we talk about the recovery, it's recovery from COVID, but it's also fundamentally addressing the development challenges that most African countries have, right? And an important part of that recovery has to be the building up of the infrastructure of all types in the economy. Infrastructure to help us to be more resilient. So when I talk infrastructure, the soft as well as the hard infrastructure. We talk about the ICT, for example, would be in that category. That it's something that would need to be done. It is not new, so I'm not saying anything new here. But what I think should be new is how this is approached. There is just too much expectation for this to be done by government. Now, we know that if you want to go at that pace, we'll be talking for another, I don't know how many decades in terms of being able to, just because of there's a limited capacity of government to do that. Which leads to the second thing that should be done, given that a lot of the recovery effort would have to be private sector led. that also means that there needs to be a lot of attention to all the things that would create the right business environment for private sector to flourish, for entrepreneurs to flourish, again, job creation, etc. And these things are essentially the improvements in the policy environments, right? Are critically important. Stability in these environments. Okay, it's one thing if I know I'm going to set up, I'm going to put in millions or billions in a particular project, especially long-lived assets. I'm looking 20 years, and I need to have a certain degree of confidence in terms of the stability of the policies that upon which I actually made that investment. Okay, and the rules, the regulations, etc. So again, those are things, and I'm just building on the fact that we need to move faster than we have moved in the past. And the only way we can move faster is to create the kinds of environments that would encourage a greater private sector participation. Now, private sector in all its forms, by the way, I think all too frequent people think of just the big, big companies, big multinationals, but it's really across the whole value chain. And then even those three things, and I'm cheating a bit here, clearly everything that has to, I think one thing that's come out of the pandemic is to ensure the food security on the continent. And again, everything that has to do with agriculture and agricultural value chains, of course, is something that needs lots of attention. Africa in general invests less than average in terms in healthcare, right? And I think this has been a jolt to the system to again look at. And most of these investments, a lot of these investments don't have to be government investment, where the government just doesn't have the space to do that. So we'd have to again encourage private sector to be significantly involved in shoring up our healthcare systems on the continent. Let me stop there. I know we have a time constraint, and I probably would love to, if there's one or two more questions to get to them.
Yes. So actually, before I have you give some closing remarks, I wanted one question, which will be a very provocative question. Now, the continent is saddled by geographic alliances: ECOWAS, SADC, SAMAC. Now it's a hodgepodge of folks at different levels. Countries at totally different levels.
Yeah.
Now, there are ideas being floated. At least even British Prime Minister had floated the idea of a D5, D7 democratic institutions, democratic countries. There are certain democracies in Africa that are, the fourth republic, the Ghanaian Fourth Republic, at least for the last 25 years, has stood the test of time regarding democratic, dispensation. And there are, a few countries like that in the continent. Now, is it time for us to look at, the democracies in Africa banding together?
Banding together. Wow. You mean the United States of Africa type of binding together, which is obvious that's a
well,
a dream.
In a group, that is separate from your CEMAC, your SADC or so, but a group of countries that pride democratic principles and open governance and can actually foster. There is no doubt that ECOWAS is driven by the democratic ideals of the Anglo-Saxons. That has been well demonstrated. So what you all did in the ADB, back in 2008, when you had the crisis, you had I think it was a G20 or so of finance ministers, of big finance ministers came together to be able to push policies or so. Now we want people or countries that are on the forefront of promoting democratic ideals to really lead, because at the end of the day, folks are just seated wherever they are, and they are camped there, And we want governments to be accountable, but it is practically very difficult.
Yeah. Listen, like you said, it's a loaded question. But I think through that question, it gives you the opportunity to touch on something we did not touch on. There's so many things going on that in the limited space of 1 hour, of course, you can't touch on everything. But I would point instead to, for example, the AFCFTA, Continental Free Trade Area, where as a result of just trying to, now of course the implementation has been delayed a bit because of COVID, etc. But there's a lot of background work, I'm sure, that is taking place. The importance of African countries trading, increasing trade among themselves, and even removing these barriers and so forth, for me is a very important first step to what you are getting at. Mm-hmm. Because when you have, because it takes, first you would have to have some common, policies, etc. And I think that's how you infuse some of these, ideals into other areas. So I would start with very practical measures. There's been a long effort to get to the AFCFTA. Let's get that implemented and encourage that and support that and get the trade flowing between countries. When you have a common interest or a common good, I think chances are you would bind together a lot more to protect that good. And I think my view is that through such practical measures, we can get to where we need to get to. Of course, there's a whole body of work and conversations on what adjustments do we make to our democracies to work best for African countries, and that's, I think that's a conversation we can have over some drinks.
No, thank you very much, Charles. This has been really great. Now, before we hang up, what are your parting words for us? What is your, what do you see, on the horizon, and as far as we respond to COVID and the trends across the continent?
Yes, the COVID has been a shock to the system, to not only African countries but across the world. And obviously, a very difficult phase that we are all going through across the world. Everybody's going through a very difficult time. Governments are fiscally stretched. Lives and livelihoods have been disrupted. But this also too shall pass, right? I mean, we don't know exactly when, maybe this year, 2021, but we sure expect to see come out of this, hopefully with fewer deaths, etc. And we should all, of course, respect the protocols and ensure that we do all the right things to come out of this with the least damage possible. But as we do that, this also is a wake-up call to the continent. Yes, many of the things that need to be done post-COVID are some of the same things that we've been talking about that we should be doing even before COVID. Whether it's the agriculture value chain, whether it's improving our infrastructure, building greater resilience. We didn't even get to talk about some of the issues with conflicts and some of the conflict-affected parts of the continent. Gender issues, critically important. So these are critically important areas of work and attention by governments, citizens, private sector, that will continue to get a lot of attention. Now, as we move forward, though, I think the wake-up call and some of the lessons from COVID, we shouldn't miss these lessons from COVID. Now, some of the lessons from COVID is just the need for greater ownership by Africa of its development agenda. When things got really rough, of course, it was natural for everybody to be looking at their own, countries, in the West, etc., to see how they protect their citizens. And it's a wake-up call to essentially ensure that we have greater resilience as a continent, whether it's in food security, whether it's in some of the PPEs, essential medical supplies, and to ensure that we're able to source those. And then very importantly, as we respond to COVID, we should also ensure that, yes, at the national level, but very importantly, at the regional level or at the continental level. And so I would say that the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area is critically important and is part of the measures that we as a continent should strongly support to ensure the greater resilience of the continent as a whole and of individual countries. So wake up call, let's not miss the opportunity. As painful as the experience has been, let's not miss the opportunity to build a better Africa. And two, let me finish with the point I made about the trust triangle. Since the key stakeholders are the citizens, the government, and the private sector, let's do all the things that are necessary. We all have a stake to ensure that that trust between the three parties is increased to ensure that we get the kind of development that we all want to see. So I'll stop there. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, Denis, and to the audience. Wish we had more time, but that's the way these conversations go. Yeah.
Well, Charles, this has been just wonderful. Really appreciate you taking the time from your very large schedule to have this conversation. I appreciate it. Our team is very grateful for your time. To the audience, I want to thank you all very much. There are these conversations, we continue to have these conversations on a bi-weekly basis with real thought leaders around the continent and outside regarding how we are responding and the different policy options that should be on the table and how to go about that. For us at the Nkafu Policy Institute, we are really honored that you continue to trust us and continue to join this conversation. So please watch out as we close today. There will be information circulated regarding our next conversations and all the other events that are in the pipeline. So thank you all very much. Charles, thank you again very much for your time.
Denis, thank you so much. And just to say that as we close, just as we are closing, the skies just opened up here in Accra and it's just raining. So showers of blessing, I think it's a good sign and of good things to come. So thank you and keep up the great work. I really appreciate the work that you're doing on behalf of the continent. Thank you.